On TV, on radio, and on your smartphone. This is talkTV.
Good evening and welcome to a special edition of Jeremy Kyle Investigates. Now, tonight we're looking at the state of Britain's armed forces. Most of us rightly hold our military in the highest of regard. But have our brave men and women in uniform been failed by our political elites? Has bean counting by our politicians put our security at risk? Recently, Defence Secretary Ben Wallace made a, blunt intervention on BBC Breakfast to deny that NATO allies were concerned about the state of Britain's armed forces.
The story in Germany is just bollocks, right? I mean, to be honest, the simple reality is NATO leadership did not approach anybody. We are taking over the VGTF as scheduled. And it's interesting that story is based on a source on a German website you and I have never heard of. So there's a lot of stories out there that I just don't think are particularly true.
Now, for all of Wallace's protests, there are concerns, particularly about the size of our army. During the Falklands War, there were 163,200 regular soldiers. That had fallen during the Iraq War to a number of 112,000. And the size of the British Army could go as low as 73,000 regular soldiers by 2025. Now, the concerns aren't just limited to troop numbers, but also our defence infrastructure. Why, for example, are support ships for the Royal Navy being manufactured in Spain and not in the UK? That was something former Defence Minister John Speller described as a stab in the back for British shipbuilding. Then there's the Ajax armoured vehicle that was due to enter service in 2017, but set back by delay after delay. And unbelievably, soldiers have been medically discharged because of exposure to noise coming from it. Now, are these isolated incidents, or is there a serious problem with the state of our armed forces? Joining me throughout today's show are talkTV's international editor Isabel Oakeshott, and represented are senior officers from all strands of the British Armed Forces. Major General Tim Cross, CBE, a retired Army officer, Rear Admiral Chris Parry, former naval officer, and former RAF Commander Air Vice Marshal Sean Bell. Thank you all so much indeed for joining me. Where do we start? Isabel, ladies first. Would that be right, gentlemen?
Absolutely.
Is Ben Wallace right? Are the criticisms about the state of our armed forces justified or exaggerated?
Well, I think Ben Wallace, a man who's known for his quite plain speaking, would also say that it would be bollocks to dismiss these concerns. Look, he was referring to suggestions that we may not be able, our armed forces are so depleted that we may not be able to take over our turn in leading the so-called Very High Readiness Task Force for NATO when our rotation comes round. And he's saying that is nonsense. I think the point is that it could well be true that we wouldn't be in a position to do that. The reality is that for a very long period now, politicians have not really thought that they needed to worry too much about defence. You know, they did Afghanistan, they did Iraq, it didn't work out too well. They felt there were no votes in it, and therefore they've been quite happy to see the armed forces run down. Now we're in a whole new era, aren't we? It's a whole new world out there where we have a war in Europe, something that those politicians basically didn't take seriously as a prospect, and we are paying the price for not being ready.
Tim, former army man, the public will see a reduction in numbers. We talked about it there, from the Falklands, 163,200 down to potentially 73,000 in a couple of years' time. What's your feeling? Is it mismanagement? Is it bean counting? Has the eye been off the ball? Because our security is always important, and I think the British public are starting to be justifiably concerned.
Yeah, and I mean, numbers I think are important. I mean, there's something which I call the critical mass of an organisation, particularly in the military, Navy, Army and Air Force, which if you fall below that critical mass, you're no longer a first-team player, really. And for me, the critical mass has always been about, can we put a fully sustainable armoured division in the field to conduct serious warfighting operations? We did that in 1990-91, which I was involved with, and we did it again in 2003. The reality is we couldn't do that today. And therefore, I think these numbers have been cut too far. Now, there's an issue, a debate, which is an understandable debate in today's world, which is about, it's not just about numbers, it's about things like AI, data, cyber, space, all these other domains that we now operate in. But it's not a matter of getting rid of something and replacing it with those. Somehow we've got to find a balance. And I think the balance has been disturbed.
But this goes to the heart of it, doesn't it? Because for years, politicians have got away with saying it's not about mass, it's not about numbers, it's about capability. And this becomes a very useful way to kind of cover up the fact that you're generally asking people to do the same with much less. And there comes a point where actually with much less, you can only do less.
Chris, can I bring you in? We talk about political mismanagement. We talk about figures. As an ex-naval man, how do you respond to the fact that our ships are now being created and built in Spain and not in the very shipyards that will create employment and success in the United Kingdom? It's changed, hasn't it? So much has changed.
As a naval officer, I don't care where my ships are built as long as they can fight. We weren't too fussy in the Second World War that our ships were being built in the United States. At the end of the day, if we're going to get the ships on time, to price and to capability, and we can't compete on that basis in the United Kingdom, there are two things that come from that. We buy abroad or we get more productive here in the UK.
What's your view on the reduction of the armed forces in their entirety? What's your view of those political decisions that Isabel's highlighted?
I think Isabel highlighted the fact that the world has changed, and it's changed pretty quickly for most politicians and senior military officers, to tell you the truth. And what we've got to do is establish the context in which we wish to use the military instrument of power. When we want to find out the objectives that we want in the world, the political objectives, we can then say what sort of forces come in behind that. I don't like to talk about numbers because until we can articulate what we need those numbers for, then we can't actually say what number of people we want.
But that's the point, isn't it? Have they, and I'll bring you in, Sean, have political figures over the years thought, we've done that, nothing's going to happen in Europe, we'll take away for the armed forces in their entirety because we're fine. Suddenly Ukraine happens and they've got egg on their face, haven't they?
I think there's two points I would make. One of which is defence is a choice. We actually spend more than the GDP minimum for NATO. We're one of the very few countries that does that, 2.3%. A lot of other countries in NATO that are much closer to this war have been spending 1.3% of GDP. They've had a wake-up call. They've suddenly got to pay their way. We're a small island nation. We shouldn't be funding the rest of the world in terms of providing their defence.
Yep.
Our defence of our realm is the first priority. Second one is to talk to the point about quantity versus quality. I come from a service where in the Second World War we had 1,000 bomber raids, each of those bombers carrying 20 bombs because the average bomb distance that missed its target was 4 miles. Today, one aircraft with 3 bombs, each of those bombs can hit a target within 4 metres. So actually, one aircraft can be far more effective than 1,000 bombers. Technology does provide you with a quality that quantity doesn't have to match. But I absolutely take the point, that doesn't apply for everything.
But it's interesting, isn't it? So we're talking about how, we're looking at the top line figures, soldiers have been cut, ships have been cut, aircraft have been cut. But you're saying, Isabel, aren't you, that they need to change the way they spend. They need to change the things that they spend defence spending on. So has the money been, changed in direction or has it been cut completely? What's the reality? What's the truth?
Well, I slightly balked at your 2.3 because I'm not sure that's absolutely up to date, is it? I don't want to teach you to suck eggs, but I think...
Wow, she's on one.
You're right.
Yeah, it's not.
It's creative accounting.
Depends how you count.
Yeah, creative accounting, which is what politicians specialise in. Look, we are still one of the few NATO member states that do pay more than the recommended 2% of GDP. Interestingly, Poland now rocketing up the league table because guess what? They're sort of right in the eye of the storm there. I think that what really is at the heart of this is what is our place going to be in the world? And at the moment, we're pretending that we can still do everything. There may be a case that we just pare it right back and just be brilliant at a few things.
Can I bring it back as well, which we do all the time on this show and on this station quite rightly, because there is a cost of living crisis in this country and people, the length and breadth of this country, are struggling to do the most obvious and basic things. And I think that's an interesting point because is there a change in the public's perception of defence? Is it a choice or is it a given? I mean, yes, Ukraine has changed people's minds, but are people, wherever they are in the United Kingdom, saying, I don't care if we don't have an army, I want to be able to pay my bills? Or are they saying, good God, look what Russia's done in Ukraine, let's get more strength?
Jeremy, if you look at Ukraine, OK, the simple truth is if you don't make the right choices about defence and security, you don't get to make choices about other things.
Yeah.
And every Ukrainian will tell you right now, they can't make decisions about those everyday things about cost of living, security in their everyday lives. You know, people are starving. They're also frozen at the moment in the middle of winter. Why? Because they weren't able to deter and resist the Russian aggression.
Gentlemen, ladies, so much more to discuss. Next on Jeremy Kyle Investigates, nearly a year on from the start of that war in Ukraine. I'll be asking how a crucial role that Britain played in stopping the Russian tanks rolling to Kyiv was. We're coming back in 3. Don't go anywhere. Britain's conversation. Oh no. With the People's Channel. No, what did I use? Every Little Helps. For God's sake, is nothing original anymore. It's finger-licking good. I'm loving it. Look, let's be honest. We don't have any fancy speechwriters here, but we do, and I promise you, discuss the issues that matter to you. Yes, I'm back. talkTV, not with Morgan, just before him. Monday to Thursday at 7 p.m. Join me. Just do it. Well, that one too.
Passionate and always straight to the point. World-class broadcaster Vanessa Feltz is on talkTV every night of the week. From politics to pop culture, there's no subject she shies away from. And remember,
if you're thinking about it, we're talking about it.
Join Vanessa Feltz on talkTV every day from 4 p.m. He's back, and he's uncensored. Debating the breaking news and talking to the biggest names. Piers Morgan is live every week with a host of stars. Uncompromising, unmissable, and uncensored. And remember,
If you're thinking it, we're talking about it.
Piers Morgan Uncensored, Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on talkTV.
Welcome back to Jeremy Kyle Investigates. Now, for all the criticism of the management of our armed forces, we did get one thing right, my friends: Ukraine. Whilst European leaders were dithering about whether Gucci shoes should be on a Russian sanctions list, the UK led the way in helping Ukraine. We have provided around £2.3 billion worth of assistance to Ukraine since the war began, and the Prime Minister has pledged to match that this year. We provided over 5,000 anti-tank weapons, NLAWs and javelins that helped the Ukrainians defend their homeland from Russian invaders. We've also given them multiple launch rocket systems that have given the Ukrainian troops a real advantage on the battlefield. And recently, we've committed to giving them 14 Challenger 2 tanks. And to look at how we give them air support in the form of fighter jets, it's nearly a year to the day that Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine, and most commentators thought that the Ukrainians did not stand a chance, but they're still fighting for their freedom and fighting with our help. I'm delighted to be joined now from Kyiv by Ukrainian Member of Parliament, Kira Rudik. Kira, welcome to the show. Can I ask you the most simple question? How important has Britain's support and aid been since the start of this conflict?
Hello, Jeremy. Thank you so much for having me. Well, incredibly important. Life or death important. Motivationally important. I cannot begin to tell you at the battlefield how much of what you have sent us we are using and sending good thoughts and appreciation back.
The anti-tank weaponry we know at the start of the war really changed the whole structure, really, because I think the Russians presumably thought that they'd enter a sovereign country and be done within a matter of days. It is now a year. What is the feeling? Do the Ukrainian people, with this support from Britain and other European countries afterwards, I'll make that point again, do you believe that you will win, you will prevail against the Russians?
Well, first of all, we don't have any other choice, any other option. We made a decision that we are going to fight, and there was not a single day or minute that we decided we will reconsider. We know what would happen to us otherwise. We have seen what happened in Bucha, in Irpin, in Izium, mass murders, tortures, stripping of the human rights. We want to fight for our freedom, for our ability to define our own future, and this is what we are doing. It has been incredibly hard. I would not lie to you. Physically, emotionally, just on everyday basis, on things like waking up in the morning and having running water and heat and electricity. It has been incredibly hard for our soldiers having to go through this winter. But all in all, though nobody believed that we will be here, we are here. We are standing, we are fighting, and we have such a high prospects on winning. We truly believe that we will win. Because, you know, our loss will mean that the whole democratic world's unity and the weapons and supplies and Ukraine's bravery together is not enough to stand against Putin. And I don't want this to happen. And I do not believe that it's not enough. I think it's more than enough. And this is why we truly believe that we will win.
What is your message to the British people? Because I'll be really honest with you, I was speaking to Chris Parry, a former naval officer, during the break, and I was saying that in this country there's a cost of living crisis and people are really, really struggling, and we continue, quite rightly in my opinion, but I'm going to make this point, to give £2.3 billion to a war that isn't just yours, it's Europe's. If I said to the Ukrainian, or you said to the Ukrainian people today, should you spend more on defence or give more to people in the cost of living, what would they say? I guess they'd probably say keep the Russians out, right?
Absolutely. And I totally agree that if you do not make a decision to spend more on defense, then you don't get to make any other decision. This is the reality. However, my message to people of Britain would be, you spent about $3 billion on supporting my country, and we are so extremely grateful for that. But right now, there is about $36 billion of Russian central bank assets stored in the United Kingdom. So we are working with the UK members of parliament to put together a bill to confiscate those assets, to cover the cost of living crisis, and to cover the support for Ukraine. Let Putin pay for his crimes and not people who support us with all their hearts. That would be fair, that is logical, and moreover, Canada and the United States already have voted for the similar legislation. So let's do that, and I think the situation will be much better and easier for both of our nations.
Kira, as ever, a real pleasure, and to everybody in the Ukraine, complete respect from everybody here in the UK. Chris, if I can bring you straight in, you made that point to me, and it's a really salient one, isn't it? Because there is a cost of living crisis. We're talking about the armed forces on this programme dropping down in terms of numbers, in terms of, you know, logistics, in terms of everything. The Ukrainian people right now would spend everything on defence, wouldn't they?
Absolutely, and we should look at what we're spending. We're actually facing not just Russia. I think we need to appreciate Russia is the wolf nearest to slay. We've got an axis of autocracy at the moment comprising Russia, China and Iran. And if you listen to what they say, they don't like us very much. And they're expressing that dislike in very aggressive terms. There's no question about that. If you were in the 1930s now, you'd be saying with Winston Churchill, there's something coming down the track here, and we need to do something about it. And right now, we're structured for deterrence, and deterrence has failed. And we've now got to think about structuring for defence, and that means ramping up all those things that will get us credible deterrence against these autocratic regimes.
Sean, you'd understand that, right? Because I'm wondering whether this Ukraine crisis will strengthen Britain's, people's will for us to be a stronger defence as a unit, Army, Navy, Air Force, whatever.
A nation's priority is to defend its people. And actually, therefore, that's our first priority, is to protect this island nation. And most of the defence planning I was ever involved with, that's where you start. As soon as you start looking at what you're going to do overseas in addition to that, that becomes choices. How much are we going to contribute to adventures overseas or whatever? And there's no doubt we have to have the ability in this country to support our national interests overseas. But how much of a lead we have to take, or how much we just provide some support, is down to cost. And I think that's the challenge here, is we're all taxpayers in this country, we're all suffering a cost of living crisis, and therefore my own personal view is there are much smarter ways that we could spend our defence budget. For many years, Luddites like ourselves were more involved in live training rather than synthetic training. There's been a ramp up in the amount of simulated training.
All three of us are not in the armed forces anymore because we were progressives. The Luddites are the ones who stayed.
Tim, what's the biggest takeaway from the war in Ukraine for the British Armed Forces, do you think?
Well, I think picking up Chris's point, as you move from deterrence to defence, you have to be able to fight. And without supplies, for example, no army is brave. Our logistics has been thinned out over the years for all sorts of reasons, largely to save money. So we have got to rebuild our capability to fight. Go back to my point about putting an armoured division in the field and sustaining it for a long period of time in war fighting, which is very different to what we've been doing for the last 10, 15 years in Iraq and Afghanistan. The Army is different to the Air Force and the Navy, it has to be said. We mustn't try and put this right across defence. But and Sean's earlier point is absolutely right. Technology and capability is different in that environment. But for me, Ukraine, for example, lost in the first 6-9 months of this war the equivalent of the whole of the British Army's infantry casualties.
These figures are extraordinary, aren't they? For me, I think the biggest takeaway is that for some years now, there's been a sort of rather casual assumption that the wars of the future will be in cyberspace or outer space or whatever. In the end, whilst the character of war is changing, we've got all sorts of new types of threats and spy balloons and so on. In the end, war is also just about killing people and breaking their stuff. And you have to have the resources to do that. The nature of war
doesn't change, the characteristics do. That's absolutely right. And I think, the real problem we've got in a democracy is if you spend too much on defence, people get upset. If you spend too little on defence, your defence isn't credible.
You see, this is my point. And the other question I wanted to do is, we've talked about the depletion of the British Armed Forces. Is any of that as a result of the Ukraine war? And does the Ukraine war inspire, and you're absolutely right, I bet it's straight down the middle, does it inspire members of the great British public to think we should spend more? Or is there war fatigue? It's another £2.3 billion next year to be part of something that we all have to support. But hold on a second, we're struggling. That's the problem, isn't it?
Jeremy, the lady from Kyiv just now said, look, we'd like to get our hands on $28 billion worth of Russian assets, OK? Let's just put that in perspective. That's half our annual defence budget. That's how small it is in terms of requirement. She says that will be an absolute game changer, yet it's half our annual expenditure on defence. If you want to get European capability up to the level of resisting Russia, for example, in the conventional sense, it's going to cost you $400 billion, a one-off. That's how much it's going to cost. But let's put that in perspective, because the Americans spend $800 billion a year on its defence provision. So, we've got to actually say to ourselves, we actually understand after 75 years there is a realistic threat to our homeland again now, and in order to deter that and, if necessary, defend it, and if you're not showing you can defend it, you're not really deterring.
We've talked about the island. Do you think NATO took Russia seriously enough?
Overall, probably not. But nonetheless, to be fair, NATO has responded, I think, very well to what's been going on. But going back to your point about Ukraine and what we've done, I've got no problem with the fact that we've given Ukraine a large capability of weapons and so forth, particularly the NLAW, but a lot of other stuff too, logistics and so on. And that's been absolutely the right thing to do. But we now, as a country, need to go onto a war footing in terms of the production of the ammunition and all the other stuff that we're going to be, we need to rebuild. And there seems to be a reluctance to do that. To be fair to some of the other European countries, particularly Poland, I have to say, they have gone on to a war footing.
Yep.
France has said it's going to spend a lot more money on defence. Germany, which was woeful for many years in terms of its defence spending, has now done a reverse on that. So we have got to go onto a war footing. We've got to get the production lines up and running. We've got to replace the stocks.
A war footing because of what's happening in the world. Would you agree with that?
I do, but going back to your point about technology, the role of technology, I think what we've also seen is that Russia fights a way of warfare where it doesn't really care about the human life element of it. It's 20th century warfare, highly attritional. Again, as a Goliath against Ukraine's David, they would have prevailed were it not for Western technology arriving. So anti-tank weapons, by all accounts, are wary about statistics. 2/3 of the Soviet tanks that are no longer available, Russian tanks available. Therefore, it has a huge... It's not only stopped the Russian advance, pushed them out of 50% of the Ukraine territory, and that's what we're providing now. It's not manpower, it's technology. And the tricky bit is, how do you equip your forces with the right balance of technology and mass?
Two final questions, very quickly. Can Ukraine win the war?
Well, what do we mean by win? I mean,
Obviously not quickly.
Well, not quickly, because it's a very serious question.
I know.
Does Ukraine think it's going to retake all of its lost territory, including Crimea? And I don't think that's going to happen. So when we talk about winning and losing, we also, the UK and NATO, need to think about what do we think that looks like? Where are we going to end up? What's the off-ramp?
How long would it take us to replenish the stocks that we say are being depleted, do you think?
How long you got? I mean, at the moment, the production lines aren't there. Just on this point about Ukraine winning the war, what we need to realise is that for Russia to win it, all it has to do is not lose the war. Yeah. Because right now, it occupies almost the whole of the bottom third of Ukraine, plus Crimea. If it sits on what it's got and consolidates, it can wait till next year, unless there are guarantees for Ukraine. It can also have a pop at Odessa and cut Ukraine off from the Black Sea.
And Moldova.
And Moldova as well. We shouldn't underestimate the ambitions. Every time Putin gives a speech, a significant speech on Ukraine, he gives it in front of a statue of Catherine the Great. Every Russian knows what that means. We're going to get the bottom third, new Russia, back from Ukraine, and we're going to cut Ukraine off from the Black Sea.
Which is another reason why, in terms of the United Kingdom, you believe, both of you, that it should be on a war footing, right?
The free world needs to be on a defence footing. We're not going to attack anybody. But the fact of life is our mentality has to be one that we're actually in a connected but contested world now, and not just in Europe. It's going to happen much more widely in the Indo-Pacific and in the Middle East as well.
I think the war footing, though, is, let's make sure the context is right here. What we actually mean at the moment, weapons are being provided out of a war chest.
Yep.
They're being provided out of reserves that were only bought enough with risk for us to manage our own defence priorities. Yeah. Every one of those we give out increases the risk to this nation of other eventualities.
The balance, right?
So actually what we need to be doing, not only nationally but internationally, is looking at what Ukraine needs for the long term, whether it's artillery rounds, whether it's anti-tank weapons or whatever, and start to find ways that they can be produced in numbers that are sustainable.
I take it beyond that, Sean. I've been saying for some time in what I've been writing is that our opponents can see the bottom of our lockers. They know exactly how long a war would take to exhaust our reserves. We've got to be in a position where our opponents cannot see the bottom of our lockers.
Right, listen, gentlemen, lady, I have to go to a break. There's so much more to discuss next on the show. With dwindling numbers and funding, we'll ask, what does the future of our armed forces look like? We're coming back in 3. Britain's conversation. Oh, no. With the People's Channel. No, what did I use? Every Little Helps. For God's sake, is nothing original anymore. It's finger-licking good. I'm loving it. Look, let's be honest. We don't have any fancy speechwriters here, but we do, and I promise you, discuss the issues that matter to you. Yes, I'm back. talkTV, not with Morgan, just before him. Monday to Thursday at 7 p.m. Join me. Just do it. Well, that one too.
Passionate and always straight to the point. World-class broadcaster Vanessa Feltz is on talkTV every night of the week. From politics to pop culture, there's no subject she shies away from. And remember,
If you're thinking about it, we're talking about it.
join Vanessa Feltz on talkTV every day from 4 p.m. He's back, and he's uncensored. Debating the breaking news and talking to the biggest names. Piers Morgan is live every week with a host of stars. Uncompromising, unmissable, and uncensored. And remember,
If you're thinking it, we're talking about it.
Piers Morgan Uncensored, Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on talkTV. This is talkTV.
Welcome back to Jeremy Kyle Investigates. Now, as we mentioned at the start of this programme, the government plans to reduce the size of our army to a number that could go as low as 73,000 regular soldiers. They say that they're trying to ensure our military is prepared for new and emerging threats. This includes spending on long-range missile systems, air defences, drones, electronic warfare and cyber capabilities. But of course, the question is, does the drive for modernisation and worrying about new threats mean that we're forgetting about the old or indeed current ones? Have a listen to this exchange. It's extraordinary, between former PM Boris Johnson and Defence Select Committee Chair Tobias Ellwood. This was in November 2021.
Aircraft, 48 aircraft, F-35s. You promised 138. You've cut back to 48. You cut back on not just tanks, Warriors have been removed completely, Hercules aircraft removed completely, and then 10,000 troopers have been removed. So we can talk about tanks, or we can talk about the wider spectrum of capabilities that have been reduced. At the very time I'm trying to make clear that there are bigger threats coming over the horizon.
Yes,
Prime Minister.
And I think what I'm trying to make clear is I think that it's now or never for the UK Armed Forces. We have to recognise that the old concepts of fighting big tank battles on European landmass, which I think is what you're driving at, are over, and there are other better things that we should be investing in the FCAS, in the Future Combat Air System, in cyber. This is how warfare of the future is going to be fought.
Wow, scary, isn't it, when you think it was only a few months later that Russian tanks did indeed roll into Ukraine. Let's see what the panel makes of this. Isabel, you watch Johnson there and you think there must be a small amount of political will to actually do something. I mean, he said on that, well, tanks aren't going to roll into European countries. And this justifies what we've been saying all the time. There's the reality, right?
Absolutely. Look, when I was researching the state of the armed forces, I spent a year or so looking into all of this a few years ago, and that was very much the mood music. You know, I heard this a lot from politicians, never from people like you, who would always say, hang on a minute, you know, you cannot afford to be complacent. And let's not forget that at the time Boris Johnson was speaking, there was already a war in Ukraine, and there were plenty of people in parts of Ukraine that could have told him that this was likely to go badly wrong if we weren't all going to take it seriously. I think that the one assumption that probably is fair now is that any conflict that we're fighting is always going to be with our allies. And one of the upsides, if there is any upside, of this dreadful situation with Russia now is that it has massively revitalised NATO. Only 3 years ago, Macron talked about NATO being brain dead. President Trump, we may remember, talked about it being obsolete. I'm not sure he really meant that. And now a massive injection into a shot in the arm of NATO. We've got more countries joining up, and hopefully an organisation that actually is going to be prepared for threats.
Can I just ask you, Sean, we talked, and you raised this a couple of times, and we saw in that, talking about existing, pushing and investing in new technologies and capabilities and changing the way that we spend our money. But isn't maintaining and strengthening your existing things just as important? Isn't that like the salesman who has to go out and get new business, but you also have to maintain your existing clients? So they've taken their eye off the ball. I mean, Johnson there, that's ridiculous.
Jeremy, before Sean comes in...
Oh, straight in.
What he said is absolutely right. Large-scale tank battles are a thing of the past. We look at
But it's happening now in Ukraine.
No, they are not large-scale tank battles. What you've seen in Ukraine is the Russians using tanks. You've seen the Ukrainians using things other than tanks to kill tanks.
Yeah,
it's been like the Battle of Agincourt. You've seen longbowmen. Well, I'm Shakespearean, so Agincourt. So you've seen basically longbowmen take down armoured French knights.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
And in this
nonetheless, President Zelensky is asking for tanks. He's asking for armoured vehicles and so on. There hasn't been a tank battle there so far, but there could be. But this balance between what, at the time that Johnson was talking, the balance between sunrise technologies, data, IT, cyber and so forth, and the sunset technologies was a very sensible conversation.
Correct.
And the distinction between the two and the balance between the two was never going to be easy. And I happen to think, for an army, we've gone too far below. The RAF and the Navy may be different.
John?
Yeah, a couple of points, really. With the greatest respect in the world, the politicians are not defence experts.
No. They don't even bother reading about it.
Exactly.
I mean, that may now change, but the number of politicians, the number of MPs that would read things like what used to be called the Strategic Defence Reviews, enormous.
I read it every night.
But the point is that the way that defence is configured is an extremely lengthy process in the Ministry of Defence. What are the military tasks that we have to do? How many troops? And the DSTL runs a whole series of very, very complex exercises to work out what's the ideal blend of forces to get the most effective on the battlefield. You synthesise that down, and out pops the end of it, the size of your armed forces for the particular task. Unfortunately, when you see the politicians talk to it, they tend to be looking for a soundbite, and I think it's really unhelpful.
But that's the point I was trying to make in the last part. Politicians are elected by the British public, and the British public will look at what's happening with their armed forces, they'll look at Ukraine, and it's that balance. I think you're dead right. It's whether you spend on technology in the future, whether you spend the money, increasing what you've already got, whether you've got one eye on what's going on in the rest of the world, where you look at what's happening in your own country. It's difficult, isn't it?
It is, Jeremy. But just to say that I want to go back to Chris's earlier point, which is you do have to start with what is your overall intent in the way you wish to engage with the world. So when you publicise global Britain, what do you mean by that? If it means you're going to have aircraft carriers and a much bigger navy and a far more capable air force, but you're not going to involve yourself in land operations, things flow from those sort of conversations.
Well, I think what we can all agree on is that what shouldn't come out of the end of this process is a procurement process that takes 30 years to produce an aircraft carrier. By the time you've actually got it,
and it doubles in
price.
price.
It's obsolete.
Well, the platform's not obsolete. You can have modular applications to go in it, including the aircraft and missiles. But the key point, this has got to be nailed, and I agree with Tim here. I sat next to Margaret Thatcher after the Falklands War, and I thought, what on earth am I going to say to her? And I asked her what she had learnt from the Falklands War, and she said, the one thing I learnt is not to interfere with the military ways and means. What I have to establish is the political outcomes that I require from my military instrument of power. And that is probably the single smartest thing I heard in 35 years of my time in the Royal Navy. If the politicians stick to establishing what they want in terms of political outcomes, and then say to the military, how can you help me achieve that? Then you can structure your armed forces in relation to those objectives.
And the problem is that is just not how our politics works. Now,
work it out. Politicians don't want to raise taxes because they voted out to pay for more defence, do they? That's the reality.
How the Chinese regime works.
Can I just bring it back to the public again? I mean, this is interesting, but it doesn't fill the public with much confidence, does it? That Chief of General Staff, General Sir Patrick Sanders, is rumoured to be considering resigning over cuts.
No, he won't go.
Well,
spectacular if he did,
well, he's still got ambitions as well, for heaven's sake.
Where do you go from General Chief of the General Staff, General...
Chief of Defence Staff, you go afterwards.
Oh, that's the next one up, isn't it?
So he could...
Yeah, and
none of you three made that, no?
Chris is being unfair here. I think a lot of senior military are genuinely concerned about what's been happening over the last few years, and people like Patrick have been speaking out quite publicly, which is, in a way, is quite surprising. The last guy who did that was Richard Dannett, who stood on the steps of the MOD and complained about snatched Land Rovers, and he got it, you know, in spades from the politicians at the time. He didn't like it much. Patrick is a serious player, and if he's saying that, then I think we should take it seriously.
But
do you think, Sean, in all seriousness, we talked then about politics and we talked about, you know, taxation. In the midst of what's going on, is there an appetite, either amongst politicians or the general public, to increase taxes to either improve or sustain what we all know to be a military that, for whatever reasons and whatever we've is not at the level it was? Are politicians brave enough to say it? And if they are, does Ukraine help? I don't know.
I'd answer that one by reversing the question, saying we've got a National Health Service that, to all intents and purposes, looks like it's broken.
Well, it
doesn't appear to be something that you can keep throwing more money at, because eventually it'll become more expensive than the Starship Enterprise. Eventually, there are some really big issues this country has to face. Defence is one of them, but it's not the only one. And as one of the former custodians of part of our defence, I think we still have lots of choices available. There are smarter ways we can do business. And what I admire about Patrick's stance is that it would be all too easy to be sat in front of you now saying, you're very smart after the event whilst you're in, why weren't you complaining? At least you've got somebody there who is trying to stand up, is trying to say this isn't right, whilst also trying to avoid getting shot down in the process. So I do think the armed forces are trying with a difficult hand, but they are getting a lot of money. The challenge is how to spend it smartly.
I mean, the thing is, the integrated review from 2 years ago is actually quite a good framework. But like with all these...
Well, can I take exception, because this is written down, you brought it up. In the integrated review, climate change was mentioned 56 times, Russia 14 and China 27. We've got a government that was... I mean, listen, I mean, I thought the Tories, when I was brought up, right, my old girl used to teach me that the Tories were about you only paid and spent what you had, and it was about strong defence and low taxation. They're obsessed with high taxation, right, it seems, and net zero. Surely the threat from Russia and China is greater than that in terms of now, isn't it?
Yeah, these are the wolves nearest the sleigh. You're absolutely right. But there is a constituency that worries about climate change. And so that constituency has to be dealt with. There's no question about it.
Dealt with or pandered to, Isabella?
Well, I chose my words carefully.
What I would say in terms of the politics of this, and you asked whether people would be prepared to pay more taxes, it really comes down to how frightened they are. I mean, look what happened during the pandemic. The government frightened everybody, frankly, largely unnecessarily. We're able to use that as a cover for spending hundreds of billions.
440 billion quid.
Right. So, I mean, we're not going to go down that rabbit hole, but if people are sufficiently frightened about what the consequences are of doing nothing, the government will most certainly be able to make us all pay a bit more.
Chris, final point?
Yeah, I mean, I think with all these things, it's a question of getting that framework right. I think the integrated review actually is not bad as a framework, but like with all these...
using the word framework. Every time you use the word framework, people
You're getting it.
But the reason I say framework is you then have to apply the ways and means to actually deliver that framework. What we haven't identified is the ways and means in which we're going to deliver the outcomes that are claimed in that.
I think we'll go to a break here, but I think the interesting point is how the British people, as you quite rightly said, are they scared enough to agree with taxation increases, or are they just, no, that's not... You know, war fatigue is another thing. I talk about it every single night. There are people who go 2.3 billion quid to Ukraine who wouldn't have said that a year ago. Listen,
next... What happened to their energy bills?
Well, she's on one. Next on JK Investigates, what are the biggest threats to the UK and the West's strategic interest? Should we be looking, and everybody's talked about it, at China as a potential threat? We're coming back in 3. Britain's conversation. Oh, no. With the People's Channel. No, what did I use? Every Little Helps. For God's sake, is nothing original anymore. It's finger-licking good. I'm loving it. Look, let's be honest. We don't have any fancy speechwriters here, but we do, and I promise you, discuss the issues that matter to you. Yes, I'm back. talkTV, not with Morgan, just before him. Monday to Thursday at 7 p.m. Join me. Just do it. Well, that one too.
passionate and always straight to the point. World-class broadcaster Vanessa Feltz is on talkTV every night of the week. From politics to pop culture, there's no subject she shies away from. And remember,
If you're thinking about it, we're talking about it.
join Vanessa Feltz on talkTV every day from 4 p.m. He's back, and he's uncensored. Debating the breaking news and talking to the biggest names. Piers Morgan is live every week with a host of stars. Uncompromising, unmissable, and uncensored. And remember,
If you're thinking it, we're talking about it.
Piers Morgan Uncensored, Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on talkTV.
Welcome back to Jeremy Kyle Investigates. Now, few experts predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union or many other significant geostrategic changes and the impact they could have had on you at home. But one country already being talked about as a threat to Western interest is, of course, China. Now, China effectively took over Hong Kong without so much as a peep from the international community. Beyond a sort of strong-worded letter or two, no country has done anything impactful about the Uyghur concentration camps. Our former PM Liz Truss, do you remember her? She was in Japan recently and urged the international community to take a much tougher approach to China.
So when it comes to China, a failure to act now could cost us dearly in the long run. Our governments must signal to the PRC that military aggression towards Taiwan would be a strategic mistake. The international community should agree a package of coordinated defence, economic and political measures to support Taiwan now.
So, of course, the question, will the West's backing of Ukraine against Russia make China think twice before sending military forces to Taiwan? Or might they think it is the perfect time to seize the initiative? Major General Tim Cross.
I don't think they're about to invade Taiwan quickly, but I do think that the challenge of China is the most important strategic issue. Somebody once said that Russia is like a change in the weather. China is like global climate change. It is much more significant, and I happen to believe that's true. To actually take Taiwan in terms of a military operation is going to be far from easy, and I don't think the Chinese are preparing to do that now. And when Liz Truss talks about what we should do, I think there are other issues associated with this, which is the whole of what's been going on in the South China Sea, the way that they're intervening in places like Africa and buying their way into countries around the world and so on. There are lots of other issues than worrying about Taiwan. I'm not saying Taiwan's not important, it is, but I don't think the threat to Taiwan is an immediate issue.
The point that you make about what the Chinese are doing in Africa is such an important one. I mean, we're busy wringing our hands and apologising over empire, while the Chinese create a whole new empire in a whole different and much smarter way, actually. If you're busy pouring money into vital infrastructure in these countries, you're basically buying their dependency, setting up new populations of your own people in these places. And sooner or later, you've got assets all over the world. And I know Chris is itching to come in on what's going on in the South China Sea, which might sound to our viewers as if it's miles away and we don't need to worry about it. But actually, the ability of our ships to get from A to B unimpeded is completely vital for a maritime nation.
Chris?
Well, OK. I mean, what we're seeing with Xi Jinping is basically the recreation of the Ming Empire in the 15th century. You're seeing the growth of a very large Indo-Pacific Trade and Tribute Hub, which is dominated by China. And in the Belt and Road Initiative, what you're seeing is a recreation of the Silk Roads over land and also the sea routes that were dominated by the Chinese Navy before the Europeans went into that part of the world after Vasco da Gama. And as Isabel says, they're trying to dominate the seas, not just in their own immediate area, but beyond that. And the sea is the physical equivalent of the World Wide Web. What actually goes on the internet physically goes by sea. Even the cables that carry the internet go under the sea. And the Chinese, quite upfront, are saying, look, we're going to control everything under heaven by 2048.
Can I just say this to you, Sean, and this is a really interesting point somebody made, that, China, we accuse them of committing genocide, we talk about, the concentration camps, and yet political leaders across the world talk of never again. But to many people, I don't know how you'd put this, but do they actually think that cheap products for their populations are more important than actually standing up to China? Because surely do we not learn from what Russia's done in Ukraine? Are we any good at predicting threats, or are we just good at talking about it?
That's a big question.
It is a big question. It's a good question, though, isn't it?
There is a worry that the more we paint China as our enemy, it becomes our enemy.
That's right.
And I do think there are parts of the world which no other country in the world thinks exactly the same as we do. So, for example, America, our closest ally, still kills people on death row. We don't think capital punishment is right. If you go
That's
back...
a whole new show.
No, but the Middle East, we talk about abuse, but they're still in an 18th century culture, desperately trying to catch up.
15th.
China at the moment, in many ways, is sitting a little bit on the fence. They're watching what Russia does. If Russia gets away with its invasion of Ukraine, there are a great deal of pundits that think it will feel empowered to therefore go further with Taiwan and others. And there is a view that we're talking about sort of liberal democracies fighting autocratic capitalism. And sooner or later, most countries are going to have to jump off the fence. So the danger of some of this conversation is if we make China our enemy, it will become our enemy. And yet it is a very powerful potential ally in the world at some stage in the future.
I mean, interestingly, when I interviewed Ben Wallace for talkTV a couple of weeks ago, I asked him at the end of the interview about Taiwan, and I was expecting and hoping for much more robust rhetoric from him. And actually, he went off on a kind of long spiel about the whole history, and I wasn't hearing, look, if the Chinese ever dared to try anything with Taiwan, we'd be straight in there helping them. None of that. So
are we guilty in the media of talking up the Chinese threat, or are we being realistic?
There is
no way.
There is no amount of military power applied by the Americans or us that can stop China invading Taiwan. So we have to use other methods to actually deter and resist that coercion. And that involves obviously constraining their trade and their ability to maintain their economy and things like that. We have to be very realistic about that and not talk ourselves in. The other thing is, the Chinese will see things in their own context. What they translate across from what's happening in Ukraine doesn't wash across directly into what's happening in the Asia-Pacific. The Chinese are very good at taking best practice from history. And that's what they're
patient.
Yeah.
Unlike us, they think in 100 years.
And that's the benefit of being an autocratic regime. You don't have to worry about elections.
Can I go full circle,
the French Revolution?
Lady and gentlemen? We've talked about defence of this country and what the future might be. We looked at the numbers at the beginning of the show. We talked from an army point of view. We've talked from an air force and a naval point of view as well. We've talked about Ukraine and the impact of Russia. We've talked about the change in perhaps what you invest in terms of the military. Cyber technology and the advancements there. We've talked also about the threat of China. Just to go around before we finish, Tim. For this government and whatever the next government will be, do you believe that defence will continue to be seen as the easy target to be stripped of spending? Or do you think that Ukraine and what's happening in the world, be it China as well, will actually focus not just politicians?
Post-Cold War, we've been involved in what people euphemistically call wars of choice. You can decide whether or not you want to get engaged. And that was our decision in terms of Iraq and the Balkans and Afghanistan and so forth. We've now got a war in Ukraine that is not a war of choice. We've had to engage in it.
Yeah.
It is nonetheless a proxy war. And one of the options, and I've heard politicians talking about this, is we just keep making sure Ukraine fights this fight so we won't have to have a direct fight with Russia. I think that's not the right approach. I think, we have to be prepared for the fact that we may have to engage in wars of much more importance than just choice. Now, there are lots of options here. I'm going back to China. One of the things that the COVID taught us was onshoring of our supply chains. Stop relying on China for all of our imports and so forth. There's all sorts of things we can do in this context, but I think defence as a key part of that conversation is going to be taken much more seriously.
Chris, to finish, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think I agree with Tim. I think Trotsky had it right. He once said, you might not be interested in war, but suddenly, war's now interested in you. And if we don't get interested in that concept as being alive in the world today, and what Sean said about this sort of split in, as I said, a connected but contested world between the free world and this axis of autocracy, we're going to find Russia, China, Iran dominating Eurasia and the waters around it, and the rest of us shut out of the globalised economy.
Sean?
I've not got a great deal more to add. I think the very assumptions that underpin how we fund defence have changed. We're not admitting it yet, but they have changed. And part of it goes back to, we're not an empire anymore, we're an island nation. We have to protect ourselves, first priority.
Got to rush you and don't want to, but go on.
First priority. Second priority is how do we work better with allies? And that's interoperability. It sounds boring. It's how we train better together, how we equip better, so we don't have this war chest emptying, that we actually are prepared both nationally and internationally for these sorts of conflicts.
Isabel, thank you, all of you, very quickly. And you've got 5 seconds. Will we spend more or less?
I think we'll spend more.
To all of you, thank you. Major General Tim Cross, Isabel Oakeshott, Rear Admiral Chris Parry, also Sean Bell, thank you so much indeed. Really interesting, and one of those things that you could talk about forever, I would think, and it will be very interesting to see whether this government or successive governments do more. Has it been highlighted by Ukraine? Will people swallow a tax increase? Thank you so much for watching. More from JK Investigates very soon. Thanks for watching. Good night. Britain's conversation. Oh, no. With the People's Channel. No, already used. Every Little Helps. For God's sake, is nothing original anymore. It's finger-licking good. I'm loving it. Look, let's be honest. We don't have any fancy speechwriters here, but we do, and I promise you, discuss the issues that matter to you. Yes, I'm back. talkTV, not with Morgan, just before him. Monday to Thursday at 7 p.m. Join me. Just do it. Well, that one too.
Passionate and always straight to the point. World-class broadcaster Vanessa Feltz is on talkTV every night of the week. From politics to pop culture, there's no subject she shies away from. And remember,
if you're thinking about it, we're talking about it.
Join Vanessa Feltz on talkTV every day from 4 p.m.